Hello, fellow geoscience instructors. My name is Bryce Henderson. I'm one of the senior instructors for the geoscience course as a mentor, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today about the peak oil game and the peak oil unit as part of Unit 6 as a portion of one of our standalone breakout sessions that you'll be completing during the spring PLI. To give you a little bit of an overview, this activity is one that I've actually done in person at the PLIs before, and it's going to follow kind of the similar guidelines, except instead of doing it in person, you'll be kind of seeing a virtual representation of this lab. But I hope that you'll find it useful and that it'll allow you to really take this back with your students and do this well. So we'll kind of go through a little bit of background. We'll give you a brief version of the student perspective. That'll be in a separate video. And then you'll also get a little bit of discussion, some tips and tricks, and some Q&A, which will take place probably virtually. So to give you an idea of where this is in the unit, this activity comes as a part of Unit 6. Specifically, it's after 6.1, so this is 6.1.2. And some prior activities that students will have done to come into this activity is the UT Lab on Energy. So they'll be looking at comparing different sources of energy in the US, Texas, and globally. They'll also have already done a reading about fracking. And so they will have a pretty good, thorough background on oil and gas production coming into the Peak Oil Lab. And then in addition to those kind of background things from 6.1, in 6.2, right before the peak oil activity, as like a homework or before class activity, students will have done a short video about peak oil explained, and it's just a quick little 3-minute visual. And then also to read an article about peak oil and whether or not it's a real concept. And I put some screenshots here of those two. So then coming into the activity, the actual peak oil game, as it's called, essentially has students taking the role of a driller or a refiner and then going through and extracting the oil from the ground, moving it over to a refinery, and then finally finishing by putting it into a finished product container. And so I have the instructions linked here, and I always recommend giving these to your students ahead of time. It seems my link's broken, so let me pause and pull that up really quickly. But I always recommend giving this like at least the day before so that students know what's going to be expected of them as they come in for the actual game. And that way, when you hit the ground running the day of the actual peak oil game, you have maximum game time. For those of you who have a block schedule, that might not be as important, but for those of us like myself on a 47-minute class period, every minute's really valuable. So I always assign as a pre-lab to read the actual instructions. Okay, so here we are on the actual handout, and I would definitely make copies of this physically and distribute it to your students as they're moving into their teams. And even though they will have read this beforehand, it's not a bad idea to give a group 2 minutes to read over the instructions and then ask a student maybe to explain what they think is going to happen. And then you can correct any misconceptions, or you can invite other students to correct any problems that they heard about what's going to happen. In a moment, you'll see the kind of the setup that I usually use. But some tips that I would always assign is make sure everyone has a role in your groups. If you have a weird number of students, you can always have that data collector be 1 or 2 people so that they're maybe making graphs as the people are refining the oil. But big picture, one person is going to be drilling the oil, one person is going to be processing the oil, and then the last person is going to be kind of just collecting data each round. And it can be useful to have multiple, especially if you're doing kind of a more advanced version of this, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The different jars that I've always used are just solo cups and then a plastic cup and then a smaller plastic cup. And I'll hold those up here in just a moment. And the reason why I've done that instead of using paper bags or things like that is just because it's a little easier for students to keep steady. Whereas the plastic bags or like a paper bag, we found that it took a lot of time for students to get the oil or the beans into one bag or out of them, and it seemed to kind of waste time, and they missed the big idea of the activity. So I'm going to pause and actually kind of show what the setup looks like, and then I'll talk about some tips and tricks. Okay, so here you can see kind of the setup, and what I like to do with this is, in addition to just having the oil field, I'll have it kind of covered up where they can't actually see what is underneath to show just for demonstration purposes. You can see here I've layered the different kinds of beans. I have the lentils, the pinto beans, the black beans, which represent the oil. And then sometimes in the past I've used marbles, but in this case I actually sprinkled in some rocks on top. And it doesn't matter exactly how you orient the beans, but you do want to try to create these little pockets like I've done. And I'll show a different one here where there's a nice big pocket of oil. and you can see at the bottom there especially, there's a huge layer. And so once you have that set up, that's the oil field. I always give groups a spoon to start out with, and they're welcome to buy other tools. But essentially, as you're spooning the beans into the refinery, which is here, I put a P on mine as like the processing plant, just to remember that this is where they're processing. So then the person who's on this team over here, the driller's just drilling away. And then the processor, which would be a different student, would be here, and they're able to scoop out just those black beans and put them into the finished product. Um, so as they're doing that, it would look something like this, making sure they don't get any kind of contamination in there. And at the root of it, that's basically all there is to the actual activity. You'll see over time that as the driller starts to put more and more in there, and then at the end of every round, whatever's left in here will be dumped out as just waste product. But eventually, they're going to get a point where they stop making so much oil and they start to kind of decline, which is obviously the big idea of this peak oil activity. Let me pause so I can then go back to my slides. Okay, and then you can see here on the backside, and you'll have to re-emphasize this throughout the activity, that anything that's spilled is a 2-bean penalty. I like to talk about the EPA and different regulations and things just to be goofy. But then after the end of every round, make sure teams are counting up how many beans they got in their finished product, recording that year's production in the data table in the notebook. That's like the most important thing for them to record, because that's what they're going to do the data analysis of. And then if you want to, an optional extension is step 14 here, where they can calculate how much they have total. And I have one person as the bookkeeper, where they're able to either make purchases of tools or employees for the team. And what I like to do is I'll actually have this running like as a slide up here. And from time to time, I'll change these costs over time. So maybe I'll say, okay, right now we have some new technology that's going to allow you to do seismic data for only 5, like as this first round here, or maybe only 1 barrel of oil, which comes out of just their total calculation, which is a separate deal. And the seismic data, that just means they get to take the cup off and they can actually see underground, quote unquote, to figure out where the oil is at. So I try to incentivize that early on to get them to go ahead and do that for each of their well sites. As far as setup wise, I give each team 3 well sites, and then I give them 2 spoons, 1 for the processor, 1 for the digger to begin. But they can buy new tools, and I have a selection of like teaspoons, tablespoons, spatulas from the chemistry department. They can add new employees, so like a new driller if their data person wants to be hired as a driller. They can even expand to other well sites if they buy one of those other leases, being able to drill in multiple sites. They still only have the 1 processor though, so they do have to be careful with their digging to processing ratio. Each round, I just start the timer and I kind of give students a 3, 2, 1 countdown, and then we stop. And then ultimately, after you've done a couple of rounds and you can start to see the production's kind of starting to taper as the teacher, that's when you can go ahead and start moving them on to that last phase. So I'll show you and give you a few tips for this last part, because I've done this several ways. It's great to just have students do their own graph, like what's in this right image here. But something that's kind of fun, and you can even do this before kind of moving on to that post-activity quiz, you could have students display their results as a class. This was my data from 2018 when I did this as a whole class. And what I did, and you can see the link here, should take you to a copy of my spreadsheet, which basically I just had students pop in their data. And over time, it populated on the screen so that we could say, oh, we're continuing production. And we thought we hit a peak here, but then we saw that, oh, actually we expanded and new technology allowed us to find even more oil. So we had the true peak. Then we started to decline, and it looks like we started to kind of taper off there for the most part. We do see a little bit of rise, but that's because you can see the yellow team really started to expand to probably a different well. If it gets lost in terms of what you're trying to see in the class data, it can be helpful to go back to that just individual group data to do a debrief. Finally, if I can go to my next slide here, some encouragement and tips and tricks. It's really important for students to really take their role seriously and make sure they're doing their best to try to dig and dig and dig. Try not to let them get into the strategy of like, oh, let's just get rid of all the rock and then we can have oil the next round. Try to just encourage them to, make as much as possible every round. And then you can offer other fun things. Like if there's too many rocks in the way, you can offer like dynamite, where they're clearing out a little bit of the materials. And then also, it's really a good idea to share that Google Sheet as a template, or just sharing it as a class document. That way you're not wasting class time doing the setup phase. So hopefully that's helpful. If you guys have any questions, as always, you can reach out to me at bhenderson@wfic.net. You can tag me on Twitter at the Bryce is right. Whenever you do the activity, I'd love to see your pictures of that. I'll be sure and share mine through Sydney as well as on Twitter. And I hope your students will enjoy it because this is one of my favorite activities that we do all year. So hopefully this is helpful, and I'll see you guys at Spring PLI.